Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's talk about leaf veins. These can be pretty challenging to paint. And if you're new to watercolor, you may want to know, what's the best way to do that? So today I'm going to show you 7 ways to do it. Some of them I really like, some of them I really don't. So we'll just take a look at it and I'll let you decide for yourself which one you like better. First one we're going to do is one with masking fluid. I do not usually use masking fluid for this, but it is a possibility, so I wanted to include it. I'm going to use a super fine paintbrush for this. It's one I've dedicated to masking fluid because it will ruin your brush. I like very thin lines on my leaves, so that's why I'm using the small brush. And because it's so small, you're not going to be able to see it very well here. So just bear with me a minute. We're going to let this one dry and we'll move on to our other one and come back to this one in a minute. But let's label each one so it'll be easier when we compare them later. And as usual, all the supplies I'm using will be listed below, but you know, this is just a practice thing, so use whatever colors and brushes you like. Now for the second one, we are going to use a lifting method. And I'm just going to use a basic leaf shape on all of these to keep them as consistent as possible, so it'll be a fair comparison. So it'll be the same color, same shape, etc. Okay, now I have a fine liner and I'm just lifting the pigment off. This is super easy, anyone can do this. You just need to pay attention to how wet your leaf is. And every time you make a stroke, dab it off on a paper towel. That way you're actually removing the pigment. Now if it's still pretty wet and it keeps seeping back into your lines, then just keep wiping it off until it gets to where you want it. If you wait too long and your paint dries before you do this, you can still lift the pigment by getting your brush barely wet and wiping over the areas. But if you get too much water on it, you could remove more than you want. So just go very gently. It's much easier doing it while it's still wet. For number 3, we're going to use a tool. And you can use any tool that you would like. You can use a palette knife, the end of your paintbrush, a credit card, or anything like that. I like using the end of a paint tube because I like my lines fairly thin, and this does a great job. You just need to be careful that you don't tear the paper by pressing down too hard because it's kind of sharp. And it's very important that you do this while it's still wet. Well, honestly, you could do it before you ever paint it and just etch it into your paper and then go back over the top of it with paint like we're going to do with the masking fluid method. But I really like painting it first and then doing the lines. I just find that's easier and it gives a much better result. Our masking fluid is dry now, so I'm going to go back in and just paint on top of it. It's that simple. And we'll wait for that to dry and then we can come back in and peel it off. Okay, the 4th one is wet on wet. You'll see this one used quite often. The thing to know here is that if you start drawing your lines, as soon as you finish painting your leaf, then your paint is going to seep out into the leaf or across the leaf. So you'll need to give it just a moment so that it's not so wet. Not dry for sure. Just not freshly wet, if that makes sense. Then you can take a darker color and draw in your veins. Now, because it's still wet and it will dry at different rates across the whole leaf surface, you may end up with some spots that are still pretty wet. As you can see here, when I pick up my brush, at the end of the vein, it leaves a little spot. And that's okay. I think it looks fairly natural, so I don't worry about that so much. Now some of these lines will do it and some of them won't. The areas that are drying a little faster are the areas that are not leaving those little spots when I lift my brush. I always like to go from the center of the vein out because I think those spots look more natural on the leaf edge, but you may like it better the other way. You might like it better with them along the center. So try it in both directions to see which one you like better. And of course you can go back over the veins if you want them darker, as long as your leaf is still wet. And as you can see, this method gives a nice soft effect. Next we have watercolor pencil on wet. Now when I was originally painting this on our little sample sheet that we have going, I accidentally moved the paper so it was kind of half on and half off the screen. So I'm doing it over again for you here so that you can see the whole process better. Again, it's just like the last one we did where we need to allow it to just barely start drying. And then we can take a watercolor pencil and draw in the lines. I chose a brown watercolor pencil, but you can pick any color you want. And the nice thing about the watercolor pencil is it gives it kind of a grainy look. And mine's not wanting to write very well, so I'm tracing back over them again. I think it helps to have a sharp point rather than a dull point. We're down to the last two. And the last two, we need to paint our leaves first and allow them to dry. So they're both a wet on dry technique. These are dry now. This first one is a very basic, straightforward technique. So it's all dry, and I'm just going to take watercolor and paint my lines on top of it. You can also use a paint marker, gel pen, a magic marker, really anything that would show up you could use. But I'm just going to use regular watercolor. These are looking kind of light to me. Sometimes you may want them light and sometimes you may want them dark. I have kind of a lot of water in my pigment right now, so they're turning out kind of light. And when they dry, they're just going to be even lighter. So I think I'll go back over them in just a minute to make them a little bit darker, just so it's easier to see them in our comparison. Now for the last one. I saved the hardest for the last. This one is negative painting, so I'm going to use my basic round brush just because it doesn't hold as much water as the silver brush does, and I really want to have good control over my water flow. A negative painting is basically just what it sounds like. Instead of painting the vein, we are going to paint the spaces between the veins. So we want to start the first layer very, very light. This is the layer that shows through as the veins. And then we go back over it with a little bit darker pigment and paint in the spaces. It may even be helpful to draw out with a little light pencil so that you'll have a guide to follow. I have a tendency to forget about that middle vein and paint over it. So a guide would really be helpful, even though I did not use it here. And then you can just keep adding as many layers as you want. Sometimes I just stop at that second layer, but then sometimes it's nice to have more definition or more shadows. So by all means, add as many layers as you would like. Okay, so that's about 4 layers now. Our first leaf has dried now, so let's remove the masking fluid and see what it looks like. Alright, that's very bright white, because of course that's the paper that we're looking at, and it looks like the masking fluid must have spread a little bit while it was drying, because the veins are much wider than I expected. So let's look. This first one is the masking fluid. Then we did the lifting method. This was the tool one. This is the wet on wet, the watercolor pencil on wet, wet on dry, and the negative painting one. This was a fun little exercise. I hope you'll try each one of these. It's really nice having this little example card to refer to. If you found this one helpful, please give me a thumbs up and let me know. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. I have a lot more really fun videos coming up soon. Thanks!